an antagonistic person might say, well, therefore, Joseph Smith gave a fraudulent, man-made ceremony. And I would say, I don't follow your argument, right? It does not follow for me that if you use a Protestant Bible or Methodist terms or Masonic symbols, even penalties or whatever, you are disqualifying what you're doing as divinely inspired and empowered. Okay?
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I'm excited for today's episode. I have back with me again, scholar and historian and friend, Steven Harper. Steven, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. It's great to be with you again.
Yeah, I always love our interviews and our discussions. You're a great scholar and historian, a very thoughtful person as well. And you've been on my show a few times. We've discussed the different First Vision accounts, and we've also discussed some of the criticisms with regards to those. We've talked about priesthood restoration, changes to the Doctrine and Covenants, and understanding the Word of Wisdom over time. And you've done books on those topics. And what we're planning to do today is talk a little about temples and Freemasonry, the influence Freemasonry had in the temple endowment, and addressing some of the criticisms that did Joe Smith just take or borrow from a modern Masonic ceremony and sort of put that in the temple endowment, sort of undermining it being ancient, a restoration, or divine as well. And then maybe just get your thoughts on some of the influences for the temple endowment, and then maybe trying to understand changes over time to the temple ceremony or temple clothing, those sorts of things. But why don't we just begin? Most of my listeners should be familiar with who you are, but do you want to give a quick bio about who you are, your academic background, and then maybe briefly you can talk about the new channel, new show that you're helping on, CES Letters. So talk about that.
All right. Well, sure. I'm a professor of church history and doctrine at BYU. I have a couple of other assignments or jobs on the side. One is to be the editor-in-chief of BYU Studies, a scholarly periodical. We publish 4 times a year. Another one is to be the executive editor of the Wilford Woodruff papers, which are coming along really nicely. Folks can see Wilford Woodruff's journals and letters and other documents, autobiographies at wilfordwoodruffpapers.org. And I'm really excited about how that's going.
That's quite a busy job being the editor, because you have to read through a lot and obviously edit and has to pass the test. So you're basically the boss man.
Sort of. I like it when people think that about it, but mostly I'm the cheerleader in chief, and we train editorial assistants who do 99% of the work, and they're really, really great. It's just impressive how fast they pick up on the tools and techniques of documentary editing. And so it's a mentoring project as well as a documentary editing project. I cut my teeth under the tutelage of Jan Ships and John Welch and others doing documentary editing. So to me, it's really important to sort of turn that back and offer other young scholars, historians, a chance to edit historical documents. There's nothing, you could listen to 100 lectures and not get the same value, benefit, educational experience as you can actually doing hands-on, thoroughly studying documents, annotating them, introducing them, and certainly transcribing and verifying the accuracy of the transcription. There's things to be learned in that you cannot pick up just by consuming a more surface level engagement. Yeah. So I learned early church history that way, through reading the documents, and I'm really grateful to mentors who introduced me to that, taught me to not get my stuff downstream from other people's opinions, but go right to the raw materials themselves, and taught me how to read them, taught me how to be critical and analytical of them. And I'm grateful. That made it so I could spend 10 years as one of many people working on the Joseph Smith papers, and we've done other things
You're
over the
also, I
years.
believe, an editor, or you're involved in the Saints volumes as well.
Yeah, I spent 6 years working on that project as well, and the volume four is just about to launch. It's very exciting. It's
Oh,
almost
wow.
done. I haven't been working on it for the past 7 years, but I've been trying to uh, pay attention to what they're doing there. It's just a very, very talented team of scholars, writers, editors. I'm thrilled with what they've done. I'm excited to see
Yeah.
the culmination of it.
That's awesome. And we're hoping to maybe do a part two. We don't know if we'll have time today because I'm on a little bit of a time crunch, but to talk about church history and sort of like
Great.
navigating and exploring controversial church history, and to get Steve's perspective on those who criticize that either the church is intentionally hidden or, like, say, whitewashed its history, and then how to deal with, say, troubling things in church history as well. But we're going to save that for a part two because I think that would be quite a fun discussion. But we're going to focus on talking about the temple endowment and masonry. And of course, we're going to try to be sensitive because some of the things in the temple endowment, we, as Latter-day Saints covenant, not to disclose, and it is viewed as sacred. So we're going to try to be sensitive. But I think there's a lot of things that we can talk about when it comes to the temple. I think in the past, we've always been hesitant as people to not really talk about it at all. And there can be a
Mhm.
lot of confusion. And I think it's also important to address some of the questions or criticisms that are leveled as well. So maybe we could begin just very simply. How would you briefly summarize what's sort of like the main purpose of our temple ordinances, and specifically the temple endowment, what we're doing and what's the purpose of it in our theology?
In September of 1832, the Lord gave Joseph Smith a revelation in which he explained that in the ordinances of the Melchizedek priesthood, the power of godliness is manifest, and that without this power, a person cannot regain God's presence and abide there, live there, stay there. And so this was the beginning of Joseph Smith's understanding that there was an endowment of divine power, priesthood, that all Latter-day Saints and everybody, all God's children need if they want to have the capability of living like him and with him. And Joseph, it'll be 10 more years after that until Joseph gives, for the first time in this dispensation, the endowment ordinances that we know today. So, as he testified, and as the revelations to him testify, he learned these things line on line and precept on precept. He was empowered and commissioned over a process of time by ministering angels sent from God to deliver these ordinances to everybody who wants them, everybody who qualifies themselves to receive them. And so the endowment then is, I think of it as a pageant. I say that word because it's a big, broad overview. I think some people think of it as sort of actual history, real footage from the Garden of Eden and other things. I don't think of it that way.
That's how
I
I
think of
viewed
it
it whenever I
rather,
first went through, whenever I was 19 going on my mission.
I think that's common, right? I did too. And that's because we're modern people. We live on this side of the Enlightenment and modern historical thinking. Our ancient Near Eastern brothers and sisters would have been much more adept at thinking in typological terms, thinking in terms of symbols and large meanings derived from stories.
Mm,
We think of, is a story true or false? Um, we mean by true and false something very historically grounded. Our ancient Near Eastern brothers and sisters would be a little puzzled. They wouldn't quite understand what our hangup is with historical truth. They would have a kind of a bigger definition of truth. Um, is the temple true? Yeah, of course it is. Well, was the earth actually created in 6 24-hour periods? And the temple and the scriptures say there's that creation is of a flat or earth with waters above and waters beneath, and all this stuff, and literally windows in heaven, and when God opens the windows it rains, and people would say that's obviously not true. It's not literally true. And an ancient Near Eastern person would say, I'm not even sure why you're preoccupied with meaningless, irrelevant stuff, because it's true that God created and he did it on purpose. And how and when and how long it took, I really don't care. What I really care about, you'll notice this from Lehi, for example. Lehi is preoccupied with the purpose of creation in 2 Nephi 2 and elsewhere. He's not, nobody in the scriptures is preoccupied with the mechanisms of creation. They don't care how it got created. They don't really care when, and they don't really care about the particulars mechanically. What they care about is why. Are we here on purpose, or is our existence meaningless, purposeless? And what they learn by the Lord's revelations to them is, no, you are absolutely here on purpose. You are created. You're created to become like your creator. You're created to have all power. Doctrine and Covenants section 76 emphasizes that. Doctrine and Covenants 132 emphasizes that. So, and then 100 places throughout the scriptures, we're taught that we were created on purpose. And the purpose is to rejoin our heavenly family and to become as powerful and as able to perpetuate ourselves and our posterity for all eternity. That's the plan. That's the purpose. So the temple is to teach us that plan. It's to endow us with that purpose and with the power to obtain that end, that goal, the power to regain God's presence, the power to become as powerful as our heavenly parents. I'm using power a lot here, and that's a word with negative connotations as well as positive ones. The temple and the scriptures use the term the way I'm using it in very positive connotations. No power or influence can or ought to be maintained unless it's in this godly way. Kindness, pure knowledge, no hypocrisy, no guile, long-suffering, gentleness, meekness, unfeigned love, right? And so the power we're trying to be endowed with is in quite a distinct opposition to worldly power, political power, buying up armies and navies and false priests who oppress and reigning on the earth with blood and horror, right? We see that power throughout history, and the temple endowment is to give us the real power that God possesses. And that will enable us to regain his presence. How do we get that power? We get it by learning that it proceeds from the presence of God and fills the immensity of space, and that we can accumulate it. It will cleave to us. It will inhere in us if we receive it. And so people might think, well, duh, I'm going to receive it. What do I need to do? I just go, do I cover myself with bubble gum or what? Do I get some kind of a power magnet that attracts it to me? The scriptures answer this over and over by saying, when you obey the laws of God, this power accumulates. And so in the temple, we covenant, we promise God we will obey his laws. And those laws include having faith in Jesus Christ, who is able to redeem us from the fallenness that we've inherited, and repenting of our sins. So we believe that God's plan will work, that God's plan in sending Jesus Christ to save us from sin and death will work. And we put our faith in that. And then we show that we want it to work for us by repenting. Repenting doesn't make you clean by itself. Repenting is a signal to your Heavenly Father and your Savior that you want them to do the saving work that they are capable of doing. We're not. I sometimes think of this in terms of willing and able. In the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord says, what I need from you is a willing mind. I need your heart and a willing mind. If you can do that, then I am able to make you holy, the Savior says. So the
Right.
temple is an endowment of power that can make us holy. And our part is to make the covenants and then strive to keep the covenants, renew those covenants regularly and sincerely, and let Jesus do his saving work in our life.
I love that. I think that's a really good summary and overview. I like how you touched upon how it's not meant to be viewed necessarily as all literal historical scientific fact. There is this depiction of the creation, the fall, and it's very much like us participating in this ritual drama.
Yeah,
Very much us sort of seeing ourselves as Adam and Eve and our
exactly.
fallen separation from God. And it's like this descent and then this ascension back to the presence of God and making these covenants and promises. And it's us becoming like kings and priests or
Well
queens and
said.
priestesses unto God, gods and goddesses.
You've got it. You understand the temple, right? Um, yeah, it's a symbolic pageant. I'm not saying there are not historical elements of it.
Sure.
I believe that Adam and Eve are historical persons. Now, I don't know the particulars, right? Where do they come in the history of people or hominids, and how does that work? I don't know. I don't pretend to know that, but I think of them as historical. But more than that, I think of them the way that Temple teaches me to think of them as types, right? These original people, this original daughter and son of God, typify what I'm supposed to do, which is to make and keep covenants so that I can regain God's presence, right? Be clothed with his power and live in the light of the knowledge that he bestows upon me, that he's got a plan. It centers on Christ. And if I take upon myself the name of Christ and strive to keep my covenants, which ally me with Christ, right? They make him and I one, at one. And then he makes me holy so I can regain God's presence. It's a lot more about the temple endowment is a lot more about how all of us, it's the story of all of us, typologically, rather than a strictly historical account of our first ancestors.
That's a good clarification. And you touched on before that you see line upon line, like different influences in the coming forth of the temple endowment. So before we sort of dive in specifically to Masonry,
Mhm.
are there some things that you see in some of Joseph Smith's either revelations or the translation of the Bible or interactions with, say, heavenly messengers over the years that you see as also
Yeah.
being influences or perhaps a catalyst for the coming forth of the temple endowment as well?
Oh, most certainly I do. Now, if you were to say, well, show me put hard lines around these things, show me exactly what Joseph Smith gets from which source on what date. I can't do that, and neither can anyone else. But the people who have studied these things well and for a long time can say there is a whole lot of temple endowment in the sacred grove. Don Bradley is one who has thought really carefully about that. You've got the same cast of characters in the grove as you do in the garden. You don't have Adam and Eve, you have Joseph Smith, but you have an actual being from the unseen world who's trying to thwart God's plan. You have the Father and the Son. You have the beginning of a long ongoing endowment of divine power. So you certainly see in the book of Moses, which the Lord reveals to Joseph Smith really quite early in the restoration. You see temple there. It's there in the book of Genesis. It's in the book of Abraham that Joseph is going to learn between 1835 and 42. And of course, it's as we've said, there are elements of the temple endowment throughout the Doctrine and Covenants. There are explanations for why we need an endowment and for what the endowment consists of. There are also hints scattered throughout that Joseph Smith knows a whole lot more than he has put on record for us. The best example of this is Doctrine and Covenants section 128. This is a letter that Joseph Smith writes to the saints in 1842, just a few months after he has given the temple endowment for the first time. And he says, he sort of muses about past experiences where he's received line on line and precept on precept. He mentions meeting Michael or Adam on the banks of the Susquehanna River and learning how to discern true from false messengers from him. He talks about Peter, James, and John attending him, Gabriel, Raphael, all these angels, he says, with their keys, with their powers, giving here a little and there a little, confirming our hope. And we realize when we pay close attention to church history, about 80% of that stuff he's never told us before. And we don't
Right.
have any other records. So where and how and when does Joseph Smith receive the temple endowment? I'm not sure, except it sure sounds like he gets endowed with power by ministering angels over a period of 15 years, and then is ready to give us a kind of a packaged version of it. When he does that, when he endows Brigham Young on May 4th, 1842, he says, Brigham, this is not arranged right. I've done the best I can. I want you to organize and systematize these ordinances. And Brigham takes that commission and does it, and then hands it off to Wilford Woodruff, who's an apostle and the president of the St. George Temple in 1877, the year that Brigham Young is going to pass away.
Very interesting. I remember whenever I interviewed Jeff Bradshaw, he focused on the Book of Moses as well as like
Yeah,
an influence, but not just for like the creation, the fall narrative, but something that I'd never noticed before is he said those five specific covenants that we covenant to in the temple, that they can be found throughout the narrative as well,
yeah,
which is likely being an influence for that. And I found here in Doctrine and Covenants 124, so this was given in January 1841. So
yeah,
this is concerning the Nauvoo Temple. But I thought these verses were quite interesting. So this would be over a year before he would have became a Mason, but also introduced the temple endowment in May. Verse 40 says, And verily I say unto you, let this house, as in the Nauvoo Temple, be built unto my name, that I may reveal mine ordinances therein unto my people. For I deign to reveal unto my church things which have been kept hid from before the foundation of the world, things that pertain to the dispensation of the fullness of times. And I will show unto my servant Joseph all things pertaining to this house and the priesthood thereof, and the place whereon it shall be built. Now, maybe this is just my interpretation of this, but it seems like the Lord's indicating that more would be revealed, things which have been kept
absolutely.
from the foundation of the world related to the priesthood and sort of like higher ordinances coming forth as well. So I guess if you're trying to make the argument that this idea for a temple endowment came March 1842, it seems to be that the Lord is saying in this revelation over a year prior that more
Yeah,
is going to be revealed concerning his ordinances.
yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. Anybody who's not already decided that Joseph Smith is a fraud and wants to know what are the sources of his inspiration, whether they believe or not that it's divine, they will notice that he is receiving and writing about, talking about things that are related to the temple endowment very early on. Um, I don't deny the influence of masonry or whatever it might be. I don't know exactly what the dimensions of that are,
Right.
but it's a way too simplistic explanation to say Joseph got introduced to masonry in March, and by May he had turned that into the temple endowment, and that's all there is to it. That'll satisfy you if you're looking for an excuse to stop your investigation into what is motivating Joseph Smith. What is the source of his revelations? You know, yeah, you can write it off easily that way. A lot of people do. I can't, and neither can Jeff Bradshaw or any of the people who've actually read more, right? It satisfies you if you want to stop your investigation and easily explain Joseph Smith away. It does not satisfy you if you've read the Doctrine and Covenants, and Book of Moses, Book of Abraham, Joseph Smith's revision of the Bible, et cetera, and learned about Masonry. It's too simplistic.
Right.
Masonry is a part of the picture. It's not the whole picture.
Okay. So maybe we could touch on talking about masonry. Maybe we could talk a little about what masonry is. I've done sort of like deeper dives
Yeah.
with Jeff Bradshaw, we did an episode on this, and Hayden Carroll,
He,
who's
he's
also
just,
already into the
as you
Mason.
probably know, he's just written a great big new book on it.
Oh yeah, good
It's
chunky book.
great for you to talk to him. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. But maybe just briefly, you could share sort of like what Masonry is, and then when Joseph Smith, was introduced to Masonry in Nauvoo, and then after that, maybe we could touch on what are some things which are similar between the two ceremonies, but then some things which are different as well.
Sure, you bet. Masonry is a fraternal organization. It's a brotherhood. Masons meet together in lodges. Um, their lodge meetings are transformed. They're good at typology. They understand that the stories they tell each other and the basis for their organization are not strictly historical. They're symbolic and metaphorical, allegorical, and so Masons might meet in a tavern in upstate New York, but when they meet there, they'll transform that tavern into Solomon's Temple. They'll have depictions of the pillars of the temple, and they'll have other symbols and images, clothing, ritual gestures, secret words, and they'll use all of these to tell each other the story of their founding, their origin. And it starts for them in Solomon's Temple. Hiram Abiff, the architect of the temple, was true and faithful. He could be counted on to do what he said he would do. And he would never do something that he promised he wouldn't do. And so some of his less faithful subordinates conspire to kill him when he will not reveal to them the word of the master mason, the key word. And so the lesson here is you want to be like Hiram. You want to be so faithful that your fellow beings can count on you to do what you say you'll do. You want the
True to your
emphasis is on
word.
integrity, true to your word, right? True to your word. And so nobody can prove that this story is true. It's not a historical story. It's based really thinly on a passage in the Old Testament about a widow's son of the tribe of Naphtali, right? So it's an elaboration of what we imagine might have happened in the building process of Solomon's Temple, and it's typical of other stories that the Masons tell each other. So we can't find any of this in historical records until the 1300s, and even then, it doesn't tell this ancient Masonic story. It just tells us that Masons, literally bricklaying, stone laying Masons, are beginning to gather together in your neck of the woods to create guilds and brotherhoods that look after each other and each other's families. By the 1700s, we see that in their records that they're telling these stories about their origins. And they crossed the Atlantic Ocean. They spread into other parts of Europe and elsewhere around the globe now. And so Masons in their lodge meetings will induct new members. The way you get into a lodge is to prove your faithfulness and fidelity, first of all. And then you can enter as a apprentice. You can be raised as or not raised, sorry, enter as an apprentice. What are the words here? You become a fellow craft. There's a verb for that. I can't remember what it is. And then
Initiated or
initiated. Maybe I'm conflating the entering and the fellow craft. I think that's right. And then raised as a master mason, right? And what the argument is here is that Joseph Smith enters the Nauvoo Lodge on March 15th, 1842, and he receives the first 2 degrees that very first day. He's raised as a fellow craft before they're done for the day. The very next day, he's raised on site as a master mason by Abraham Jonas, who is Jewish and is the grand master mason of all masons in the state of Illinois. And he's come to Nauvoo specifically to initiate a lodge, to install a Masonic lodge there among mostly Latter-day Saints. And nobody knows for sure why he does this. It's quite unique. It's quite rare, I should say, to raise someone on site as a master mason. It means that they sort of skip all of the rigorous and hard proving oneself and mastering the Masonic ceremonies and knowledge. So there are reasons to speculate that maybe Jonas is courting the saints' political support. Right? If you raise Joseph as a master mason and you install a lodge with 200 plus Latter-day Saints as masons, including most of the apostles, and part of your fellowship with your fellow masons is to support each other, have each other's backs. That might be a way for Jonas to increase his chances in his bids for office, political office in the state of Illinois. What are Joseph's motives? Nobody knows for sure. His journal entry says the facts that I told you about on the 15th. I was, initiated into the lodge. By the 16th, I was raised as a master mason, but they don't say why he's doing this or what he thinks about it. The next day, he is there in the exact same space. This is on the second floor of his store in Nauvoo. And that's where and when the Relief Society is organized. And it's quite clear from the records of Joseph and of the Relief Society that he is thinking in Masonic terms and sometimes speaking in Masonic terms to them, and also telling them there's an endowment of power for them and they need to prepare for it. Bishop Whitney, who's a Mason long before he's a Latter-day Saint, and he speaks also to the Relief Society, and he also emphasizes that there's a priesthood endowment for them, and the church won't be restored, and the men and women won't be endowed with power until men and women are endowed with priesthood power. It's just exactly what Joseph Smith is teaching as well. This is different from Masonry. In Masonry then, and still largely today, women are not included at all. And they're not part of the group. Joseph Smith, from the very beginning, emphatically includes women in the endowment of divine power. And President Nelson reemphasized that in his talk, Spiritual Treasures. It's the same thing Joseph Smith was teaching in 1842 and 43. I'm getting off track, wandering in the weeds from your question. Maybe you need to
Oh,
get
that's
me
fine.
reoriented.
Yeah, so you're saying that it's a different narrative centered more around Solomon's Temple and this figure Hiram
Yes.
Abiff. It's this fraternal organization. They would make certain promises, and it's more about sort of having this brotherhood and doing good in the community. I believe that you do have to believe in some sort of a deity to be a Mason, but it's not really a religious ceremony. It's certainly not Christ-centered. And as you said, one of the differences is that in our LDS Temple ceremony, you would have both men and women participating in this endowment of power.
Yeah, you're right about that. So one way to think of it is that Masons make solemn agreements with each other to be
Right.
faithful, true to each other. In the temple, Latter-day Saints make solemn covenants with God to be true and faithful to God and to be endowed with God's power. Masonry sort of generally assumes the existence of a God, but it's not about making covenants with God.
Right. So I want to get back to the criticism that you would see, on the internet or critics would make is that, 7 weeks after Joe Smith becoming and advancing to Master Mason, in
Yeah.
Mason we have the Temple Endowment, and they would say that there's either similarities or things which seemed identical in, say, shall we say, some of the signs, hand clasp, some of the symbols like the compass and the square, some of the spiritual language and vocabulary, and even some elements which used to be our endowment, like the penalties that have been removed in 1990, that this is him clearly taking from a Masonic ceremony, and the criticism being that he's sort of mixing that with his own sort of theology, his own, you could say, doctrinal innovations in scripture, but just showing that the ritual of the endowment is of modern origin. What would be your response to that? And maybe we could then talk about what you make of like any correspondences to ancient rituals, but what's your response to that? That this just shows that he's borrowing from a modern Masonic ritual for the
Yeah.
ritualistic part of the endowment.
Well, it's a very important question. Let's first of all establish the facts. By facts, I mean things that are verifiably true, regardless of how you interpret them. It doesn't matter if you
Good.
believe Joseph Smith's prophet or believe he's the devil.
Yeah.
What are the facts that are the same? And you just did a fantastic job of stating them. So let me just reiterate. Those facts are that the documents say that on the 15th and 16th days of March 1842, Joseph Smith was inducted into the Masonic Lodge of Nauvoo, and he was raised on site as a Master Mason. Thereafter, he served the lodge as a chaplain. He was not deeply engaged in the meetings, but he was a member, and he was occasionally there. He knew about what they were doing. He was aware of the Masonic rituals and lodge. And then on the 17th day of March, he organized Relief Society. He addressed the Relief Society about a half a dozen times over the next year or two. He spoke to them frequently about being endowed with power, being able to keep secrets, being good Masons. He told them Bishop Whitney, who was endowed by Joseph Smith in the first group on May 4th, 1842, along with Heber Kimball and others, all 9 of them were Master Masons. All 9 of the first people Joseph Smith endowed, excuse me, were already Master Masons.
Right.
Many of them had participated in Masonic rituals in that same space in Joseph's store where they were endowed. Okay, so these are the facts. Now, it is not a careful thinker will recognize that those facts are not themselves a narrative, and that a person can put meaning to those facts. You can interpret them in a variety of ways, and they do not interpret themselves. They do not prove that on their face, they do not prove that Joseph Smith received the endowment by revelation from God.
Right.
They do not prove that it endows a person with divine power and enables them to regain God's presence. Those are matters of faith, right? I would have to decide that's what the endowment means to me and put my faith in that. And it's yet to be seen whether I'm going to get into the presence of God and abide there. So it's also the case that these facts do not prove that Joseph Smith just borrowed Masonry and made the temple endowment out of it. Some people will scoff at that and they'll say it's so obvious, it's just as plain as can be. This is a post hoc ergo propter hoc argument, right? The chronology lines up. He does Masonry in March. He does the endowment in May. There's so much similarity. Even Heber Kimball says so. I now know for absolute certainty that Joseph Smith simply made the temple endowment out of Masonry. No, you don't. Okay, it's more complicated than that. Way more complicated than that. So the people who go hook, line, and sinker for that simple version of after the fact, therefore because of the fact, they are eager to have a simple explanation for why Joseph Smith's not a real prophet and then to dismiss him. Case closed. We're done investigating, right? But it doesn't work for many of us who realize I don't doubt or dispute those facts, but they don't account for everything. In fact, what if we said, what happens if you line up the endowment with the Masonic ordinance rituals? How much overlap? Really precious little, in a sense. What if you lined up the endowment with the Bible? A whole lot more, right? Book of Moses, Book of Abraham, a whole lot more. Joseph Smith is, if anything, relying a whole lot more on Genesis and Moses and Abraham for temple endowment than he is on Masonic rituals. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying he doesn't rely on Masonic rituals. Okay? Neither did he. Heber Kimball took for granted. Heber Kimball, by the way, is a Mason from the 1820s. Long before he's a Latter-day Saint, he's a Master Mason. And he's in that first group of 9, along with Bishop Whitney. These are people who know very, very well what Masonry is all about, and they know very well by firsthand experience, by being there on the first day the endowment is given, what it's made of, and they do not default to the uh, argument that John Bennett is the first one to advance. Joseph Smith just stole Masonry and remodeled it a little and gave the endowment, right? So that's a fact. It's important for people to know all the facts about this. How do you account for the fact that really well-informed master masons were endowed with power by Joseph Smith, and Heber Kimball, for one, was super excited about it? We have received precious things on the priesthood through the prophet. He wrote to his fellow apostle Parley Pratt, "You must come and get them for yourself. They are not to be written." There's a great similarity, he says, between the priesthood endowment, and Masonry. Many things are correct, he says, but many
Yes.
things are degenerate. So uh, Heber is way better at um, sort of giving us a more critical, analytical view of the similarities, because he's not interested in simply dismissing Joseph Smith. He recognizes Joseph Smith endowed me with power in the same space where I also participated in Masonic ordinances that had a fair amount of overlap, but not the same thing. I didn't receive the same thing from the lodge as I got from Joseph Smith. For Heber, it was what he'd always been looking for, and what the lodge could sort of partly satisfy, but not remotely, ultimately satisfy. Purpose, right?
Right.
Purpose and power to obtain that purpose in the original creation, and then redemption from the fall and exaltation in God's presence. That's what Heber found in the temple endowment that Masonry never had in mind, never did give to him. And so, anyway, the argument originates with John Bennett. If your listeners don't know him, he's evil. Okay, the sexual predator. He's evil. He's been thrown out of a Masonic lodge before. He's a terrible, awful person. And as soon as Joseph Smith gets close to exposing him, he turns completely on Joseph Smith. Right? If folks are going to trust John Bennett, then they'll trust anything anyone says, no matter how perverse that person is. As long as it supports their preconceived conclusion, they'll believe anything.
Mm.
John Bennett is not a credible person. Heber Kimball and Newell Whitney, they're credible. They know Masonry backwards and forwards. They know the temple endowment. They were there the day it was first given, and they both recognized the similarity, and that what Joseph had done had endowed them with power that went way beyond similarities. You want
Right.
to
So
talk
you said
about,
that they saw it as two different ceremonies because they were Masons, so to them they didn't
right?
just see it as him stealing, that he's almost utilizing some of it on, or you could say repurposing or restoring. Now, I do think that there are some elements you could say in some of the ritual actions or signs or tokens which are like very similar, if not identical,
Yeah,
some symbols. I think sometimes critics can maybe overstretch some things. Like as I've been doing a little bit more research into it, from my understanding, the level of masonry that Joseph had advanced to, the ritual clothing would have only included an apron. I believe
mm-hmm.
it was royal arch degree that had more of the robes and things. So to say that he would have got the ritual clothing from his degree of masonry isn't probably quite accurate. Or if they try to argue that's where he got washing and anointings from, well, the washing and anointing ritual, that was in 1836 in the Kirtland Temple before he was initiated. Or the compass in the square, which is a symbol in masonry, but they're tools that are, I believe, pressed up against against their body, against their chest. Whereas in our temple endowment, there are symbols that we have both in our undergarments and a place in the veil as well. So there's some differences as well.
Yeah,
But from what I've read of what a lot of the early Latter-day Saints believed, and perhaps maybe Joseph as well in his history, believed that he's almost restoring like this ancient ritual. And like you said, that masonry is perhaps maybe this corrupted
Yeah.
degenerate form. At least that's what a lot of the early Latter-day Saints seem to believe in, that Joseph Smith is restoring an ancient ritual. And what I find interesting is, as I've looked into, the work of Jeff Bradshaw and Matthew Brown, they point out to some interesting connections or correspondences between some ancient rituals, be it in early Christian rites, coronation ceremonies of monarchs, or priestly
Hmm.
initiations, not identical, but many of those symbols that people would point to, those ritual elements in Masonry, that we can see some of those things in ancient antiquity across different cultures, different rites and rituals, almost showing that like they're not maybe necessarily exclusive Masonic elements, but that this could be Joseph repurposing and restoring them back to their ancient form. What's sort of like
Yeah.
your thoughts on that? Perhaps there being some relationship to things in antiquity from our temple endowment.
I think it's undeniable that the temple endowment and lots of different ancient, medieval, etc. rituals are very similar, have lots of similarities. Now, all I'm saying there is similarity, right? I don't know what the reason for that similarity is, but you're exactly right that early Latter-day Saints attributed it to a common cause. They believe that Masonry and the temple endowment originated in the same fountain, right? Wherever it came from, it was God and it was early. And as Heber Kimball put it, Masonry had become degenerated. But many things are perfect, he says, meaning they are precisely the same as the endowment. Now, I am okay with common cause. I think there is, there's a Priscotology, there's an original revelation. Um, you see it recorded in the book of Moses, in the book of Abraham. We don't have near as much detail about it as we would like to have, but I believe there's an original sort of endowment. I also believe that Joseph Smith uses anything he can find in the 19th century and adapts it, restores it, right? We use Methodist terms to this day. General Conference, we have Methodist hymns, we have Catholic hymns, we have all kinds. We use a Protestant Bible. Um, we borrow a lot from all over the place. And it would not surprise me in the least if we borrowed elements of Masonic ritual practice, typology, imagery to deliver the temple endowment. I don't know that we did for absolute positive certain, but
Mm,
it sure looks to me like that's what happened.
right.
Now, somebody will say, well, therefore, then it is fraudulent. It is not a real endowment of divine power. And I would say that does not follow. That's not true. Your second premise doesn't follow your first. Let me be clear. My first premise is that the endowment of divine power comes ultimately from God. My second premise is it might be that Joseph Smith, in preparing and giving that endowment, used elements in his culture, his time and place, to deliver it.
Right. So
Maybe,
like the presentation method.
yes. And then an antagonistic person might say, well, therefore, Joseph Smith gave a fraudulent, man made ceremony. And I would say, I don't follow your argument, right? It does not follow for me that if you use a Protestant Bible or Methodist terms or Masonic symbols, even penalties or whatever, you are uh, disqualifying what you're doing as divinely inspired and empowered. Okay, so I don't know for sure why you were quite right a bit ago when you said a lot of what's dropped out of the ceremony over time is the more Masonic resonances, right? Some things that are very, very similar or the same in Masonry and the temple have sort of we've just got rid of them. I don't know the reasons for that. I'm not privy. I wish I were. I'm not privy, though, to the meetings where those things are decided. But I have a sort of working hypothesis. One is that they are sort of this worldly stuff, and you can take them or leave them. right? They don't have to be in there for you to be endowed with divine power. The priesthood power by which the ordinances are pronounced and officiated, that hasn't gone anywhere. That was restored to Joseph Smith by ministering angels. And it is as present today as it was on May 4th, 1842. The sacred promises to obey the laws of God are the same. And the sacred promises from God for obeying his laws are the same. And what's dropped out? A bunch of stuff that didn't have to be there. Now, I'm not sure, though, that we should just dismiss the penalties, some of the associated ritual that go with the penalties, as simply Masonic and therefore gone, because that kind of stuff is as ancient as can be.
Yeah.
Ancient Near Eastern people made solemn obligations to God, and they would signify how solemn, and God would do this himself by swearing, by even making a gesture and saying, look, this is the punishment I will accept if I am unfaithful to my promise. This is all over in the Book of Mormon. This is the titled liberty that Captain Moroni does. We know he makes this flag, but we may not be as attentive as our ancient Near Eastern brothers and sisters would have been to the way that tearing the garment and making a solemn vow
Yeah,
about,
he like rends the garment, almost like symbolic of like this is what we would do if we don't adhere
yes,
to this
and
covenant, to sort of show the strictness of it. We
exactly.
need to follow it very closely.
And notice that all of his people understand exactly what he's doing, and they do it themselves, right? They say, us too, right? You can tear us apart. And this is, you could find a dozen of these in the Book of Mormon at least, and you could find hundreds of them in the Old Testament. And this is the way ancient people signified how solemnly they were committed to their God, and their God did it back to them. When you would cut a cow in half, or whatever, all kinds of different forms of this, you were saying, I will be like this animal. You could cut me right in half if I break my vow, my solemn covenant. Now,
In modern day, it's almost like when children like cross my heart, hope to die.
yes,
And I find that really helped to contextualize them for me to sort of make sense of why were maybe some of those penalties in
yeah,
the temple endowment and how that would have made sense. At least in ancient Near East, we can see those sorts of
right,
elements. And even elements like the ritual embrace. I'm not saying that these ceremonies are identical by any means. Ancient Egyptian temple stuff, their ceremonies, their gods are different. But I watched a presentation by Carrie Mulestein, and there was again some parallels. I don't know
yeah,
exactly how they relate. Some hypothesize that this came from, the first pharaoh of Egypt was a descendant of Ham, so he didn't have the priesthood. It talks about this in the book of Abraham, so he's imitating the order and rituals of the fathers.
mhm,
But he showed some interesting, I'll just say parallels that there would be for priests or pharaohs, like a washing and anointing that they would go
yeah,
through. As they passed through their temples, there would be this raising of the ground as they're traveling through the temple to get back to the holy sanctuary. And the ceiling would lower as well. And there would be like ceremonial clothing and like ritual gestures, and they'd have to pass like gatekeepers and give like certain passwords
yeah,
or names. And then right before entering the sanctuary or like the Holy of Holies in Latter-day Saint terms, there would be like a ritual embrace with a divine figure,
right,
which was identical to the 5 points of fellowship, looked pretty much identical to me. And then some of the promises they'd be given for entering the heavenly company.
yeah,
And I guess one thing that sort of has opened up my eyes is I don't think we can clearly say that like we find an identical ancient ceremony, which is our endowment, but throughout different religions, different rites, different rituals, different ceremonies, you can see some correspondences to some of those signs and gestures in the endowment, or like the symbol of the compass in the square, or like ceremonial hand clasps, or like
yeah,
ritual clothing or garments with marks, that those things are not clearly modern or just Masonic. You can also see some resemblances in the ancient world as well. So to make the argument that this is only exclusively from a Masonic ceremony, like I think Larry, since the time, knew that Joseph was borrowing from masonry, but believe that he's restoring something ancient. Now,
Yeah.
perhaps it's a mixture of there's some ancient elements, and in some cases he's utilizing more modern Masonic either ritual or vocabulary. But I think that's interesting to see some resemblances, especially some coronation ceremonies that I've looked in different cultures. They vary across different cultures, so I'm not saying it's identical, but these
Mhm.
general themes of like washing, anointing, receiving a new name, sometimes like an undergarment, and then throughout the ceremony they'd have like royal robes and they'd make
Yeah.
gestures and oaths before they'd be crowned or like a priestly initiation. And we go through the temple endowment to become kings and priests unto God. So it's you can see the general themes or narrative that there's almost some similarities between some of these ancient rites and our endowment, but perhaps he's utilizing but repurposing some of the symbols and signs for masonry.
Yeah. I think that is really, really well said. I think that explains it. I'm, I know some Latter-day Saints think that if it's a real divine endowment, it has to be exactly like what must have happened in the Garden of Eden,
Yeah.
word for word. I don't believe that. There's no reason to believe it. Rather, what you notice is these sort of common elements,
Mm.
emphasis on purposeful divine creation, fallenness, redemption from fallenness through Jesus Christ. And these principles and truths are communicated with rituals, and these rituals share common motifs and elements through time. Are they precisely the same? We can't show that they are. We can't prove that they are. Do they have to be? I don't know of any reason they have to be. Do they do the same kind of work in people's lives? Yes. Most of us humans like rituals that give meaning and purpose to our lives, that orient us in the universe, right? Tell us where we are at, where we're headed, and show us how to get there. That's what the temple endowment is for. And it and similar things to it have done that work for people from the beginning of when we can start looking at people's records on earth. So I know that in my life the temple endowment is an endowment of power. It gives me power over my fallenness. It gives me power to regain God's presence. It gives me power to have my posterity secured to me for all eternity. And I'm not saying I'm there yet. I'm on the quest for this power, but I am way ahead of where I would have been if I hadn't made very solemn obligations that I take very seriously a
Mm.
long time ago. So, I mean, a person could deny it to me. They could say, well, Joseph Smith just invented that. And I'd say, well, practically speaking, whatever he invented, whatever he revealed and gave was an endowment of power in my life. I can't deny or refute or dismiss what a powerful blessing it is to me and to so many, many others. I love it. I want the good things that it brings to me. And I don't know for sure, as I was saying, why some things have dropped out, but I think one thing to certainly consider is that when the endowment doesn't do anymore what it's supposed to do, when maybe it distracts from what its purpose is, then you translate it, right? Just like you would translate something into a language that's we could understand today that we couldn't have understood if we didn't. You got to translate the temple. And
Mm.
here's the thing: ancient Near Eastern people would not have had to have the temple translated from the time Joseph Smith gave it. But 21st century people, modern people,
Yeah, yeah.
you have to tell them, look, Peter, James, and John are not just actual historical people, they represent messengers from God, right? You wouldn't have had to tell ancient people that. You wouldn't have had to tell them you're like Adam and Eve. They would have recognized, ancient Hebrew people would have recognized in the very names Adam and Eve typology,
Mm.
right? He's named Earth and she's named life or living or to be, right? They would have, you wouldn't have had to tell them she's the mother of all living. They would have got that from her name.
Right.
Adamah, this guy is mankind and dust of the earth. And nowadays, you have to handhold us modern people, and you have to explain symbols and typology. Jesus is the altar. Jesus is the veil, right? Um, you have to show us pictures of Jesus so we realize, oh, this whole thing is about Jesus Christ and how I
Even the
covenant with
symbolism and the meaning
God.
of the garment as well,
Right.
representing like the atonement, like covering us. I think that's
Yeah.
good. They made that more explicit, explaining some of the
Oh,
symbolism
yeah.
of the endowment.
Me too. Me too. So it has always been thoroughly Christ centered, but modern people miss the imagery and symbols. So you'll notice that what's happened over time, over my lifetime, frankly, since I've been going to the temple to receive the endowment, is that the graphic penalties that make modern people sick to their stomach and think, oh my goodness, I can't believe God is that mean and so forth. We have so we're so ignorant of the fact that that's a very ancient way of saying I mean it. I mean to keep this promise so much that if I didn't, you could cut me in half, right, or whatever. And God says, as I live, right, I mean to keep my promise. I swear on my existence. And people say, me too. I swear on my very life that I will keep this promise. And you signify it by this maybe over the top hyperbolic way of, you dramatically tear your clothes or cut something in half or signify that you're going to. That used to be a powerful way of saying, I really, really mean it. To a modern person, you have to back away from that because they take it way too literally. They're not very good at the symbolism of it, the typology of it. And so you just explain it in literal terms. This is a really serious covenant. Don't break it. Don't take it lightly. Treat it seriously. Right.
Right.
So it's a translation of the terms and the symbols of the endowment into modern understanding. Me and my kids are a lot better at getting more meaning out of the endowment today than I was when I went originally when I was my kid's age. And it's because it's been translated by prophets, seers, and revelators into terms and conditions that speak to a modern person like me. That doesn't mean that the earlier versions were wrong and this one's right. It doesn't mean that this one's wrong and the earlier versions were right. It means that God adapts his teaching and delivery to our capacities, which is just what Joseph Smith and Brigham Young taught that he would do.
Right. You pretty much answered that question I was going to ask about those who have concerns about if this endowment was revealed to Joseph Smith, revelation from
Yeah.
God. How can we make sense? How can we justify there being changes or alterations to the endowment ceremony or to like the initiatory or temple clothing over time? And it seems that you're sort of saying that it's very much adapted to like current circumstances as well. It's living,
Yeah.
breathing, and dynamic. That there can be almost like additional revelation. I think there's been some good things added to it
Oh,
as
yeah.
well, and things taken away as well. What would you say to someone just playing devil's advocate here who might make an argument that like, if other religions say change their ordinances, we might argue like that's sort of like falling into apostasy. But when we do it, we argue, say, continual revelation, and it's a
Yeah.
double standard. And they might point to a quote from Joseph Smith that I'm going off memory here that ordinances instituted from like the foundation of the world can't be altered or changed. And they
Mhm.
might see that as like, how do they square that with changes being made? Do you have any just insights on that?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things about that. I'd say that's a criticism I would want to be mindful of, and that I might acknowledge there's something to it. Right? We should not apply a double standard. I shouldn't say, well, Latter-day Saint ordinances are valid because they've never ever changed in any way whatsoever, and Catholic ordinances are invalid because I see this change in them. I'm not. You're not going to hear that argument from me.
Right.
And I don't hear it from our 15 living prophets and apostles. I don't see it throughout the standard works. I haven't ever raised my hand in common consent to that. So it's not a doctrine of the church. Has somebody said it somewhere along the way? I wouldn't be surprised about that. but I'm not bound by something someone says, no matter who they are, if it's not the Lord Himself, right? So, speaking through His authorized servants in a consistent way, not one of them once, but all of them often. So, I wouldn't hold anyone of any religion to that standard, and I certainly don't hold us to that standard. I don't. There's a kind of fundamentalist strain that runs through some Latter-day Saints, and critics like to uphold it because it's easy. It's an easy whipping stick. You know, you can use it to beat the saints with. Uh, Certainly, Latter-day Saints don't have any monopoly on fundamentalism, but by fundamentalism, what I mean is that assumption that there was an original version and it is the only valid version of anything, right? And
Perfect,
that if it,
complete, unchanging.
right, that it was given once and for all, and it should never change in any way, that is simply not well founded. And you don't find it in Joseph Smith or in President Nelson or any of the ones in between. What you find is that they believe all that God has revealed, does now reveal, and that He will yet reveal many great and important things pertaining to the kingdom. And so the latest thing God has revealed is the most important, it's the highest priority. Which version of the temple endowment should I take most seriously right now? The very latest one, right? Yeah, but before my mission in the late 80s, I went and I got a different version of it. There was a lot of stuff in there that's not in there anymore. Which one should I think is the real one? Well, that was a real one. I was endowed with power. I made solemn obligations. And I promised God I would do certain things and not do certain things. And He promised me to empower me to be able to regain His presence if I was to be true and faithful to my covenants. That was real. It was valid, right? There was a guy in it, one of the actors who was played a dope on a sitcom, right? So is that a does that ruin the ordinance? Does it invalidate? No, it doesn't. It's not in there anymore. And lots of other things aren't in there, and lots of other things are in there that weren't. And so, which one should I think of as the right version? Both, all of
Mm.
them. And the one I can go and receive today is just exactly what we need for here and now. And it will continue, I assume, to be updated, adapted, translated, whatever you want to say, as the Lord inspires His authorized servants to do it. And I will follow them because the last thing they reveal from God is the thing that ought to preoccupy me and get my priority, not the earliest thing
Mm.
they reveal. Joseph Smith believed that. I don't know why some people who think they are followers of Joseph Smith don't believe it, because he didn't stay static. He didn't think he was going back to an original version and never to budge from it. Rather, he believed that very verse you quoted at the beginning, where God said, Joseph, I'm just about to give you things that have never been revealed from the foundation of the world.
Right. I remember when we had our discussion on trying to make sense of changes to revelations as well. I think we can grow up with this very, as you said, sort of like fundamentalist view that it's inerrant, infallible, and unchanging.
Right.
And it appears from Joseph Smith, his life, that he was editing or changing or expanding upon revelations like publicly, like with scribes around as well. This wasn't just something done in secret. Even he talked about in subsequent editions of the Book of Mormon, correcting and revising
Yep.
some things as well. And you quoted earlier Brigham Young saying that Joseph told him that these things aren't arranged right, that you need
Yep.
to organize and systematize it. So it seems that both our current prophets and apostles, but Joseph Smith and Brigham Young didn't have this view of Revelation scripture or the ordinances as fixed or unchanging. And even some ordinances in Joseph Smith's life, we can see some changes with the sacrament from
Yeah.
bread and wine, and then he was told to use water instead. So was the ordinance changed? Like you could argue yes, but kind of no. The ordinance itself is still the same. It's just a different thing used to symbolize the water. Or like when baptisms for the dead were first practiced, weren't they done in like a river before, and
Yep.
then later they were performed in a temple? So there can be some, shall we say, alterations, but it's the fundamental of the ordinance stays the same.
Right. Yeah. What is the endowment of? It's of divine power. That's the thing. That's the substance of the endowment. The form is much less important than the substance. If it's authorized and if it delivers the substance, then it's an endowment. Okay. And you can adapt the forms as needed, not you and me. We're not authorized, but
Mm.
their Lord has authorized his apostles and given them the keys and the commission to steward this work. And for heaven's sake, they are about it, aren't they? They are stewarding this temple work um, wonderfully, faithfully, and definitely in close concert with him. And so I'm excited whenever we get led into the bright future and adapt to it. And I'm not a person who wants to live in the past and never budge as things adapt, as the world changes and circumstances change. I can't. I'm having a hard time understanding the King James Bible.
Yeah,
I gotta,
I'm with you
I
there.
gotta, I gotta get a more modern translation to help me understand it because it's 400 plus years old, right? I don't know about you, but I don't speak Elizabethan English very well. You probably
Sometimes in
do.
prayers, but
So I need some help, and it's perfectly fine to get help translating God's words and work into language I understand. The Lord himself said this in Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, in verse 24. He said, I'm going to give my servants the revelations in their language, in their weakness, so that they can come to understand,
Mhm.
right? The Lord's going to deliver the temple endowment to me in language and terms and symbols I can understand. I can understand paintings of Jesus a lot better than I can that the altar is Jesus or the veil is Jesus. Once you tell me that and associate it with paintings of him, then I start to clue in. But not nearly as able as my ancient ancestors were to see meaning in abstractions the way that I needed to be able to do to make sense of the temple in 1989 or 90.
Right. So I want to ask, sort of coming from a devil's advocate position, because often as I'm going through and figuring some things out, I try to think about what would be the critics or, like, say, a naturalistic view or theory,
Yeah,
just to sort of account for that and sort of like how would I respond or deal
right.
with that. So a critic might think naturalistically, what if they made the argument that, say, the washing and anointing, Joseph could have gotten that from, say, Exodus, Aaron and his priests in the
Yeah,
Old Testament, and then the ritual came from sort of Masonry, and then he sort of combined it with the Book of Moses, and those sort of three main sources could sort of naturalistically explain the temple endowment, and you don't need to
yeah,
look over to like Revelation or those parallels to ancient rites that are just
yeah.
parallels. You can explain it from his environment. What would be your response to that? I guess one, why are you not fully convinced by that naturalistic explanation for the temple endowment?
Sure.
What's your response to it?
Well, it's a great question. And this is a good way to illustrate that we believe in the exact same facts, right? You just set forth sort of three objective facts. They're objective in the sense that me or I'm a believer in the supernatural, right? I'm going to interpret those pieces of evidence with supernatural power in them. And a naturalistic explainer is going to say, there is no reason and no evidence for supernatural power here, right? Simply, Joseph Smith has a Bible. He reads in the book of Exodus that Aaron and his sons were brought to the door of the tabernacle and they were clothed and washed and anointed.
Right.
And Joseph just copies that. And then he's exposed to Masonry and he copies a bunch of that. And I can't remember the third one you said, but
He produces the Book of Moses, which you could say is his own
yeah,
sort of doctrinal scripture that he
right.
produces himself, and then utilize that for the narrative or the content.
So me and the naturalistic person are working from the exact same factual basis. We have the same facts that are verifiably true. There's a book of Moses by 1830, right? By 1831. There is Joseph Smith and Masonic rituals in March 1842. And there is, I'm getting old here. What's the first one we were talking about again?
Was it Aaron and his priests in the Old Testament?
Yes, yeah, right. Old Testament, right? So you've got these sources, and now the question is, how will we interpret these facts? How will we interpret the fact that Joseph Smith has these three texts essentially? Well, I'm going to decide on purpose to interpret them as evidence that God speaks and God works in the lives of people. And my naturalistic friend is going to say, well, you have zero evidence for that. Have you ever talked to God? Have you ever seen him? I'm going to say sort of sheepishly, no. And well, then how do you know? Well, I've felt his power. I'm endowed with his power. I feel the Holy Spirit when I make and keep the covenants of the gospel. When I take the sacrament to renew my covenants, I'm renewed. In other words, I could say I have 100 evidences in my life that this works, that it's real. And they'd say, well, can you touch it, taste it, smell it? Could you give it to me? Could you put it in my hands? I'd say I can't. Well, then it's not real. I'm a strict materialist, right? If it's not material, if you can't show me something I can tangibly hang on to, then I don't believe it. That's simply a choice we make about how we're going to interpret the world. It's not that one of us has better facts and one of us is ignorant of the same facts. It's that we're just deciding how we're going to make sense of what we see, read, experience. And so, yeah, I couldn't prove it. I don't even have a desire to prove it. I have a desire to declare it. It makes me so happy. I want to share it with everybody, but I don't want to force anyone to it. I claim the privilege of worshiping Almighty God according to the dictates of my conscience, and I demand the same for everyone else. Let them worship or not, how, where, or what they may. But I don't know why anybody spends 1 minute of their time trying to undermine my happiness in the things I believe. I don't do that for other people.
No, I think that's a good answer. Like,
no matter who they are.
Yeah, that ultimately it comes to faith as well. I think
Yeah.
you can go with that naturalistic theory. I think like as you shared that it's ultimately faith and experiencing that spiritual power with these ordinances. And another thing I think I'd note as well, like in my discussions with Jeb Bradshaw, I thought it was interesting that he highlighted to me that in a lot of ancient Near Eastern temples or Egyptian temples, that it does seem to be almost like this ancient theme of like creation and garden. And you could just say that was just sort of a coincidence, but it's quite interesting that Joseph sort of centered his endowment around that narrative. That I find that quite interesting, and just certain elements that you could say are modern Masonic. It's interesting that there's some parallels in some ancient rites as well. And I find prayer circles interesting that I read some early like non-biblical but Christian texts that talk about Jesus introducing prayer circles with his disciples. And it's not something that you can prove this shows it's therefore ancient, but it's interesting that there seem to be some things which maybe we can't fully explain just from Masonry. Perhaps there could be another element as well that scholarship we're still learning about.
Yeah, you're onto something really important there. We have a tendency to not have any idea how ignorant we are. Some really impressive psychologists have researched for a lifetime the heuristics or the mental shortcuts that humans, all kinds of humans, use to explain the world around us to ourselves. And one of the most common ones is what you see is all there is.
Right.
We default to this assumption that what I see is all there is. What I see is Joseph Smith joins the Masonic Lodge in March. He gives the endowment in May. My thinking is done. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc. Joseph Smith copied the temple from Freemasonry. Well, okay, but what if I expanded my circle of what I see out a little? What if I included the book of Moses? What if I included the book of Abraham? What if I included a little Egyptological research and understanding? What if I included much more ancient Near Eastern motifs and thinking, right? All of a sudden, I would realize that what I thought I knew is nowhere close to satisfying explanation for the facts. So it works, right? If all you're interested in is getting rid of the burden of having to believe in Joseph Smith, well, you don't want to look any further than March to May 1842 and
Right.
John Bennett, and you want John Bennett to be your interpreter of those facts. And then you're done. And you can go off with a clear conscience and never worry again about having made solemn covenants. But if you expand your knowledge beyond that, you recognize that that simplistic way of explaining the facts is inadequate. What you see is not all there is. Maybe all of us should keep seeking and keep searching. So what we see is bigger and bigger and bigger. And then we have to have interpretations that account for that bigger body of evidence. And the simplistic one from John Bennett simply won't suffice anymore.
Right. No, really good point. So I just want to ask one or two maybe final questions and wrapping up. I think this has been a good discussion. The church has an essay on Masonry. I've used some of it in my early videos, and I think it's a good essay. You know, it's relatively short, but I think it explains what Masonry is, about the influence it had on the temple endowment Joseph Smith becoming a Mason, and it talks about two views that people might take when it comes to making sense of Masonic elements, shall we say, in our temple endowment. And I wanted to get sort of like your take on where you sort of fall down. One view is that there's a difference between the presentation or the ritual of the endowment and the actual endowment, the endowment being the doctrine, the covenants, the narrative, and the presentation is sort of like the ritual presentation. So perhaps Masonry isn't ancient, or the ritual aspects don't go back anciently, but he's utilizing sort of modern rituals as a way to clothe and a way to present the endowment. And then the other sort of view some might take is that Masonry perhaps has these elements which are corrupted or degenerated, some scholars believe came from early Christian rites and symbolism, and that perhaps Joseph is restoring an ancient ceremony and Masonry was a catalyst. Or you could take maybe a mixture of both. He's utilizing, repurposing some modern elements, but there's some things from ancient antiquity. Do you sort of hold a view between sort of like those three options, or are you sort of tentative to say where would you sort of lean in your interpretation of the temple endowment?
I love the way that you laid that out. What I know is that in my life, having made the solemn covenants of the temple endowment and striving to live by them and then to renew them regularly it gives meaning and purpose to my life. It it gives me power to overcome the behaviors and attitudes and attributes that would keep me down and that would make me a worse person for the rest of mankind, a burden instead of a blessing, which I hope to be someday. So I would say, from a pragmatic perspective, I have been endowed with power in the temple. That's what I know. And the way I know it is my daily experience. And then you're asking, yeah, but what do you know about where the endowment came from? I'd say, I don't know. What I do know is a lot of facts, right? As you and I have discussed, you know them, I know them. I know what Joseph Smith's journal says. I know what Heber Kimball's letter to Parley says. I know what the early Latter-day Saints said in their records. I know what the scholars have written about these things and how they've interpreted them. I know Mike Homer's book on it and David Berger's work on it and Jeff Bradshaw's. I haven't fully digested his book yet, but
It's
in the
good.
process, right? Yeah. In the process of obtaining that knowledge. And then you would say, so you know now exactly where the endowment came from. I'd say, no. Which of your three options? I'm not sure. I can see meaning and value in all of them.
Right.
All of them are plausible. And I guess if you said, yeah, but what's your best guess? My best guess is that you've got a combination. You've got all of those things. Are there ancient influences that Joseph has access to by revelation and by studying his scriptures? Yes, no doubt. Are there more modern things? Does his experience in the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge in March have anything to do with it? I'd say I think it probably does. I think there's enough overlap, and that uh, people in the know acknowledge that, like Heber Kimball, to say I think there is some. And then if you said, well, what are the limits of it? What exact parts come from ancient sources? What come from? I wouldn't be able to tell you or delineate. What's just comes from somewhere else. I don't know. So that's a terribly unsatisfying answer,
Oh, it's a good
but
honest answer.
it's much better to learn all the facts and then separate them from the way those facts have been interpreted. It's important to learn the interpretations and then examine them and compare them to the facts, and then to consciously pick the interpretation that best accounts for the most facts.
Right.
But also then to hold that tentative until you know. And what I now know is that there are a few good interpretations that account for the facts pretty well, but I don't know that well enough to exclude any of the interpretations you proposed. And I also don't want to make the false dilemma of it has to be either this interpretation or this interpretation or this one. I want to remain open to combinations
Mm.
of these interpretations. Did Joseph Smith restore an ancient ordinance, or did he create a modern one? Why are you forcing me to pick when God doesn't put that choice in front of me, right?
Mm.
Joseph Smith didn't make or put that choice. So I think it's a false choice, a false dilemma.
Mm.
And I'm open to all the options that are available, and maybe others yet that we haven't thought of.
Okay. And I'd love to just ask maybe just one last question. I think this has been a good discussion for you to share your insights. I think like whenever I first went through the temple endowment, not criticizing my temple prep teacher, she was a lovely lady. But I sort of felt whenever I first went through the temple endowment, I was like, what on earth have I just done? I'm in a cult. This is really weird and creepy. And I think had I have like known and had a lot more like context into
Yeah.
the history, learning about masonry, learning about symbolism and ancient, temple rites, symbolic of kind of what priests would do, or coronation ceremonies, and it's this sort of like representation of this falling away for the presence of God, this heavenly ascension, and we're making oaths and promises to become like kings and priests unto God and return to His presence. It might have contextualized a little bit more. I guess what advice would you give to someone who is, I guess, going to go through the temple endowment as like a mini temple prep, or those people who have maybe had a negative experience? I never had a negative experience going through the temple. I always had nice experiences, felt the peace in the temple. I feel like I understand, appreciate the ordinance more. There's still way more that I'm learning. I think I get a lot more out of it seeing the symbolism. But I know there
Mm-hmm.
may be some people who have had maybe slightly disturbing experiences, and it wasn't as spiritual experience as they have liked.
Yeah.
What would you just say to that?
This is a great question, and the answer is easy. I would invite them to listen to President Nelson say, if you struggle with the temple, go more, not less. Let yourself be open to the possibility that you're using a heuristic, a mental shortcut, that what you see is all there is. Be open to the possibility that you're a modern person and your modern sensibilities have made you ill equipped to interpret rituals that have ancient meanings and symbols and analogies. So learn more, go more, and learn more, and listen to people who can help you understand. Carrie Mulestein, Jennifer Lane, et cetera, can help us understand what we might be missing. And when they orient us just a little bit better than your temple prep teacher and my temple prep teacher were able to do, then all of a sudden we start to see beauty and power and purpose in the temple that we weren't capable of before. And like you, I don't want to throw my temple prep teacher, away or dismiss their sacred offering to me. It's simply the fact that they didn't have the tools to help me acquire the tools to understand the temple better. We sometimes are impatient. We're greedy. We think, I was, 18, 19. Somebody else should have explained the temple to me and done all the hard work to get me prepared. So I had a great experience my first time around. I'm not sure that's the right way to approach it. What if we were more humble and said, this might take me a while, maybe 50 years to get oriented to the temple? And what if I followed the prophet's counsel to go more, not less? What if I did it with a prayerful heart and an open mind and said, Lord, teach me? And then what if when I'm not in the temple, I listen to Stephen Murphy and others who could help me get a little better insight and better orientation? People, my own experience is I went to the temple the first time and I felt like I was in a foreign country, or like you said, in a cult of weirdos. I remember thinking, what church is this? Now I am at home there. I understand it a little better. I've done a lot of reading, a lot of thinking, a lot of maturing. And now I realize, oh, the temple is home. This is the place where I go to get my bearings, to be endowed with power, to grow closer to God, to enter his presence. And so I'm just grateful for that, 30 years plus of not giving up on it. And I hope everybody else will not give up on the temple. If you have a bad experience, then keep working at it. Don't quit. Don't bail out. Don't pout about it. Get the help you need from people who can help you get oriented to it, and follow your living prophet, and his words will come to pass. You'll love it better the more you work hard to love it better.
Love that. Well, Steve Harper, I think this has been a really good discussion. I've appreciated your time, sacrificing your time on a Saturday morning to do this with me, and for sharing just your insights and your knowledge as well, and your faith as well, when it comes to your faith in being a Latter-day Saint in the restored gospel and with temple ordinances. And thanks so much for coming on. I recommend people to go check out some of the great work you've done. I know you've got an article on temples and masonry, but you've done loads of other great books as well. And your new YouTube channel with, sorry, what's the name of the young man you do?
Yeah, Easton Hartzell. He's the real brains and inspiration behind it. And we do a website called CES Letters, plural.org. And the videos are on YouTube and also podcasts wherever you can get those, cesletters.org. It's a place where we answer the CES letter, and not in a hostile way. We've learned, sadly, that the letter was never really very sincere at all, like we thought it was. But we do realize there are lots of people who are sincerely troubled by the issues that Jeremy Runnels raises in that letter. And we're trying to minister to them, to him, if he's interested, and to anybody else who might want to engage with those issues and think through them. And so we're just trying to add some value there, hopefully, and work on that project together.
Oh, it's a great project. I've enjoyed the episodes and interviews that have been done there, and I think we could probably save some of this more for our next part on church history. But I think it's very important to try to confront some of those controversial things in church history, or some of the criticisms that are brought up, and trying to address them, trying to contextualize them as well, rather than trying to run away from it as well. That can help people in their faith journeys.
Amen to that. Yep. Like awesome. You're doing.
Trying anyway. Thanks so much for coming on, Steve. And listeners who've been watching, if you enjoy this video, give it a like, comment underneath as well. Check out the resources as well in the description, and we'll see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time on Mormonism with the Mirth. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.